I want to point out that there is an important distinction in international humanitarian law between civilians and combatants. And international humanitarian law calls on all parties to a conflict to heed that distinction between civilians and combatants, and to make every effort not to cause harm to civilians. And I think there's ample evidence that Israel rejects what's called the principle of distinction in international humanitarian law. And I think this is demonstrated in three different ways. One way is that Israeli leaders themselves have, on numerous occasions during this war and in previous wars, made it clear that they don't distinguish between civilians and combatants. So we have Israeli President Isaac Herzog, who recently said, it's an entire nation out there that's responsible. Or Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that he ordered a complete siege of Gaza because we're fighting human animals. So I think that's kind of been made amply clear by political leaders who set the tone that their fight is not against militants or against combatants, but they are also fighting against the civilian population of Gaza. Second, there's a very little known document that was authored in the early 2000s by the former head of Israeli military intelligence, Amos Yadlin. And he and his co-author explicitly reject the principle of distinction in international humanitarian law. And they say that that principle should not apply to Israel. And I've written an article, which will be linked, that responds to that article and shows why their arguments are baseless. But there they explicitly say that more priority should be given to saving the lives of Israeli soldiers over those of Palestinian civilians. And that's a war crime according to international humanitarian law. It's not acceptable to give priority to the lives of soldiers over the lives of civilians. And then the third, I think, piece of evidence that shows that Israel doesn't heed the distinction between civilians and combatants is that in all previous wars in Gaza and in their actions in the West Bank, as well as in their wars in Lebanon, the number of civilian casualties has vastly outnumbered the number of combatants killed. So to take one example, in 2014, there were 2,189 people who were killed in Gaza, of whom at least 68% were civilians. And 16% of those were children under the age of 12. So the numbers just speak for themselves. In the 2006 war on Lebanon, some 1,200 Lebanese civilians were killed by the Israeli military, and that was around 96% of the total. In the current war, we still don't have the final figures. The killing is still going on. Civilians are still dying every day, but there's well over 3,000 dead as of this recording. And the preliminary figures suggest that 2/3 of them are children and women, which means that vastly more are civilians. So I think those three pieces of evidence demonstrate amply that Israel doesn't respect the distinction between civilians and combatants, and indeed that it targets civilians. And I would argue that it targets civilians for two reasons. One is that there is a widespread belief among Israeli political and military leaders that by targeting civilians, you can make them turn against the militant groups. And this has been something that Israel has adhered to since the days of fighting the PLO in Lebanon, fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also now fighting Hamas. And there's absolutely no evidence for that. When you make people pay the price of and target civilians, you don't make them turn against the militant groups. That is just patently false. But the other reason, I think the more important reason, is that Israel thinks that by putting pressure on Palestinians, it can make life so uncomfortable for them that they will leave or somehow just abandon their land and homes. And I think that That's simply not going to happen. I think Palestinians have learned the lessons of history, and they're not going to go anywhere. So, targeting civilians, making life uncomfortable for them, is not going to lead them to leave. Israel sometimes says that the reason that civilians are dying is because Hamas is using civilians as human shields. And again, I think there's really no evidence for that at all. So the Goldstone report by the United Nations in 2009, after the 2008-2009 assault on Gaza, found that there was no evidence of Hamas using Palestinian civilians as human shields. And in fact, the Goldstone report found that Israel was using Palestinian civilians as human shields. And this is confirmed by Israeli journalists like Amir Ahas in Haaretz, and also by international journalists like Clancy Chasse in The Guardian, who've written extensively about the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields by Israel. And in fact, in 2014, the Israeli Supreme Court found that there were 1,200 occasions where in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, between 2009 and 2014, Israel used Palestinian civilians as human shields. Ever since the beginning of this war, we've been told that Palestinian militants are terrorists, that Hamas is a terrorist organization, but Israel, in fact, is targeting civilians and is doing violence against civilians to achieve political ends. And that's just the textbook definition of terrorism. So this is Israeli state terrorism, and it should be called as such. If anyone wants to call Palestinians terrorists, they can't do so and not also apply the word terrorist to Israel.